grants and state grants going forward. Jamie, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to meet you and look forward to working with you.
Yeah. All right. Anything else, John, that I didn't have on my list here?
I think that's everything, Michael.
That's everything. Okay. Well, with no further ado, we're going to hand it off to Serena and Chad to continue our walkthrough on the NEPA requirements and some things that we need to be on the lookout for. Serena?
Thank you, Michael. Let's see, is Chad going to share the presentation? There we go. So for anybody that wasn't there last week, I am Serena Brownlee with HDR, and I am the NEPA lead for CBO, helping with all the compliance requirements. And Chad will be talking later about Section 106 requirements, and that is his specialty, National Historic and Cultural. All right, so last week, as Michael mentioned, we went in depth into NEPA requirements for BEAD projects. And this week, we're going to pivot more towards discussing what permits and authorizations may be required for your projects. A lot of the broadband projects are going to require a variety of permits, right-of-way authorizations, environmental reviews, and agency coordination that is going to depend on your land ownership, your jurisdiction, and what environmental impacts you have along your project route. So today we'll be going over all of the types of authorizations you see on this list that you might encounter in Colorado for BEAD projects. Next slide, please. So we shared this slide last week, but I just wanted to highlight again that these local, state, and federal considerations, some of which we'll be discussing in more detail today, really need to be identified early through your desktop review, utilizing all of the GIS and mapping tools available through CBO and NTIA. The goal of the early desktop reviews is really to identify any permitting problems at the earliest time so that we can resolve them at the lowest level possible. And that's easier to do when you identify your everything early. So next slide, please. Okay, so as you know from last week, I like my fun graphics. This one just highlights the fact that a really simple, 1 mile fiber horizontally directionally drilled trenching project can trigger a number of local, state, and federal permits or authorizations, such as the ones listed here. And all of these different permitting agencies and authorities are going to have different requirements, different review timelines, and different methods of communication. So it's really important that you complete the permit questionnaire early to identify all of these potential permits or authorizations. The guidance document that we are preparing right now is going to have the permit questionnaire as an attachment, and we hopefully we'll be able to get that out in the next week or two to you guys. Well, CBO will. And another thing is, identifying all these required permits is going to be necessary for your milestone schedule so that you can proactively track all these permits. And some federal agencies may require pre-application meetings for certain permit types. And that's another reason it's really important to identify all of these issues early so that you can get those scheduled. And we'll go into more detail on some of the federal and state processes in the coming slides. We can go to the next slide, please. And this one's just a reminder from last week too, that your project type and your environmental impacts are really going to dictate whether a CADX can be used and whether additional documentation that's listed there is going to be required to meet the federal compliance requirements. And we'll talk through some of this further documentation that may be required for projects that trigger these extraordinary circumstances. So, sorry, that's just a reminder from last week on that. And next slide, please. So we already touched on some of these with the graphic that I showed earlier. But once you have done your desktop review and identified all your land ownership that's crossed by the project components, it's really important to start reaching out early to the agencies just to confirm or identify what right-of-way permits, easements are going to be required for your project. If your project does cross federal land, such as BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Refuge, or Bureau of Reclamation, you will need to obtain a right-of-way permit, or in some cases, BLM and Forest Service require a special use authorization to access their land. So some projects may only trigger local land use permits, but sometimes these local land use permits, in my opinion, can take just as long as federal permits and can often have more stringent monitoring or restoration requirements attached to them. And next slide, please. So now we'll just quickly go over some of the Colorado specific environmental regulations and permits. So some of these you may not have dealt with before, like um, the Colorado dredge and fill permit, which is called Reg 87. This is through the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They're the one that administers most of the state level authorizations and permits that are going to be applicable to your broadband projects. So this new Reg 87 program protects state waters, and state waters are defined as waters that are no longer covered by the federal Clean Water Act. It's a fairly new process. So ephemeral streams, intermittent streams, some ditches and canals, those are now protected under this state dredge and fill program. And when you're trenching through a ditch or a canal, you may need to determine, we will need to determine if a dredge and fill permit through the state is required. And this should be identified early during your desktop review when you're pulling in that National Wetland Institute data to determine if there's any waters or wetlands in your project area. A couple other state permits that you're likely very familiar with: dewatering permits. These are just going to be required for activities like pumping of groundwater or dewatering trenches. Stormwater discharge permits, those are going to be required if you're disturbing over an acre of land. So if you're doing any kind of linear trenching operations that impact over an acre, you will need to apply for that permit. And then, of course, the municipal storm sewer system permit, that's required for, anytime you're constructing within city streets or municipal right-of-ways. And next slide, please. So now we'll move into some of the federal permits that may be triggered. This one is a specialty of mine. I've been doing this for a long time in my career. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, it regulates the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States. So that includes wetlands, streams, open waters, and other aquatic resources that are federally jurisdictional. So your projects could trigger Section 404 review when you are trenching across any waters, when you're installing culverts, if you're doing directional drilling near waterways, or placing any fill in wetlands. That's going to trigger 404 review. So most broadband projects are likely going to qualify, if needed, for a nationwide permit 57, and that is designated specifically for telecommunication line activities that have minimal impacts. So depending on your construction methods, most BEAD projects are likely going to just avoid waters entirely or qualify for that nationwide permit. But it's still important to, like I mentioned, identify your aquatic resources early using the tools that are online, the National Wetlands Inventory Mapper, and overlaying your project design early just to see if you trigger any Section 404 issues. Just wanted to mention that, in very rare cases, an individual permit through the Army Corps may be required. And that would be for projects that don't meet the minimum impact requirements for a nationwide permit. These are usually for large projects that impact over a half acre of wetlands or waters. So not anticipating many projects would trigger that. But if the project does require a Section 404 permit, it's really important that we reach out to the Army Corps early, just to ensure that we're doing the most efficient permitting process. And next slide, please. So the next federal compliance process that must be completed prior to NEPA is Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. This basically requires federal agencies to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that their actions do not jeopardize listed species or critical habitat. The Endangered Species Act prohibits the take of species, and take can mean, harm, harass, pursue, in addition to shoot, killing, collecting, or disturbing them. So your BEAD projects could impact listed species. And the NTIA has developed a really cool guide to streamlining the Endangered Species Act compliance, which I included a link, I think on the next slide for, but not yet, we will also be referencing that in the guidance document, and it walks you through all of the steps to streamline this process. So I thought it was really helpful, but we'll go through each of these steps quickly, just so you know how to initiate this process. Next slide, please. So step 1 is to review the list of activities that NTIA and Fish and Wildlife Service have predetermined that have no effect on listed species or designated critical habitat. So they've come up with a list of activities that do not require any further Fish and Wildlife consultation. So if you have no ground disturbance and no environmental impacts, no consultation needed. If you're just installing a cable on an existing utility pole and you're not going to have any ground disturbance, then you don't need to consult. So make sure you check that list of activities, because that will dictate if your project's exempt from Section 7 consultation. However, if it's not, we'll go to the next slide. So if your project is not on that list, you will still need to conduct an online IPAC review. And IPAC is the official species list through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there is a link there. Anybody can go in and sign up for an account. You just need to have it's a federal government official account, but it's pretty easy to get. And then you'll need to define your project area within their map interface. You'll need to identify what your project type is and what construction activities are going to be occurring. And then you'll need to review that list of species that it gives you hopefully with your consultant or not, just review that list of species. And that list will need to go with your NEPA compliance eventually. So make sure you save that list, because it is required for submission to NTIA. And next slide, please. So once you have your IPAC list, you want to go through that with your consultant, or you can often get a determination from Fish and Wildlife early if you have your biological assessment or some kind of biological resources report, just documenting, the project area impacts. So once you've made a determination of a no effect, a may affect, not likely to adversely affect, or may affect, likely to adversely affect, this is going to dictate whether or not you need to go through informal or formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of the BEAD projects are going to be informal or no effect, because we're going to be implementing the best management practices and mitigation measures early to reach that no effect or not likely to adversely affect determination. That's a Preble's meadow jumping mouse on the bottom. You probably will see them come up on your list. They're pretty widespread across the state, and any kind of projects that impact riparian habitat or wetlands are going to have to consider impacts to that species and other species. Next slide, please. So here I just wanted to highlight very briefly what informal versus formal consultation. Like I said, most of the BEAD projects are going to be informal consultation or no consultation. So if you need to do informal consultation, you're going to need to prepare a biological assessment or a similar biological report, submit that to the Fish and Wildlife Service. It typically takes 30 to 45 days for the informal process to get a concurrence from Fish and Wildlife. If you have a project that is going to adversely affect species or their critical habitat, you may need to go through the formal consultation process, and that can take up to 135 days and does have to be initiated by the NTIA. I forgot to mention that informal consultation can actually be done by you or your consultant, but if it's formal consultation, that does have to be led or initiated by the NTA. So definitely work with your design team, your consultant early to identify, any potential design changes or BMPs that can help avoid impacts to federally listed species. And next slide, please. So we also need to consider Colorado state listed species as part of the NEPA process. There's a really great site called Codex. It's the Colorado Data Explorer that you can go to that will identify if your project area overlaps any state listed species, ranges, any mapped habitats or conservation areas. So it's a great way to identify if there's going to be any sensitive wildlife resources that need to be considered. This could require you to coordinate with CPW if your project is going to impact any of these state listed species or important wildlife habitats. Sometimes there's big game seasonal ranges that need to be avoided during certain sensitive times of the year. So CPW may recommend avoidance and minimization measures for your project, such as, seasonal timing restrictions, especially for raptor nests, and if you have any in-water work. You'll want to definitely make sure you document that any CPW coordination and any additional conservation commitments in your NEPA documentation. That photo on the right's a greater sage grouse, which is a state listed species in Colorado. If your project overlaps with sage grouse habitat, that could trigger Colorado Parks and Wildlife coordination and potentially seasonal restrictions, especially if you're in lekking habitat or priority habitat areas for this species. And next slide. And my last slide is Migratory Bird Treaty Act and Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Some broadband activities that might trigger trigger review for impacts to migratory birds and raptors include if you're installing a new pole, a new tower, any kind of vegetation clearing along fiber routes, or work on structures that may support raptor nests. So make sure you review and incorporate the BMPs and mitigation measures from the NTIA into your project design and schedule. This will save a lot of time later in the process because they've got all of the BMPs listed out in there by resource, and that will be linked in the guidance document, and it's also linked on this slide. In Colorado, the main thing is that you want to avoid any ground disturbance or vegetation clearing during the migratory bird nesting season, which is pretty much during your entire construction season. I know, March through August. But, if you do need to construct during that period, you can have a qualified consultant conduct pre-construction nest surveys to clear the area. However, that does need to be done, only a week in advance of any vegetation clearing. And then if you wait, you need to do it again. Definitely, if your desktop reviews come up with any eagle or raptor nests, you need to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife and CPW on potential setbacks for those nests. And again, the BMPs are listed there. And I will pass it over to Chad now for 106.
Great. Thanks, Serena. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Along with NEPA, this is one federal law that every BEAD project will have to comply with. It is a separate law than the NEPA, but some of the information that comes out of Section 106 will also inform the NEPA process, especially when we're looking at those extraordinary circumstances that Serena mentioned earlier. If we have adverse effects or potentially adverse effects to historic or archaeological resources, that could be an extraordinary circumstance of consideration. So, what exactly is Section 106? Essentially, it's a federal law that requires federal agencies to account for the effects on historic properties from their undertakings, which is, a project or a proposed action under NEPA. What is a historic property? Essentially, it's building structures like bridges, objects statues, historic districts, and archaeological sites that are either listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And it's essentially a consultative process. It's led by federal agencies, and with the BEAD program, Colorado Broadband Office is a joint lead federal agency with NTIA. And it's a process where you consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, any tribes that have an interest in the area of the project, and also other identified consulting parties, which may include municipalities, historical societies, and even individual members of the public. And there's under Section 106 in the regulations, there are program alternatives that provide streamlining of the Section 106 process. One of those streamlining tools is called a program comment, and it's essentially when the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is the federal regulatory board for Section 106, gives a comment on if a federal agency goes through these specific steps, then they've fulfilled their Section 106 obligations. And the FCC did one for communications projects on federal lands many years ago. And the Advisory Council recently expanded that to include both federal and non-federal lands to make it applicable to the BEAD program. So with the program comment, there's a few requirements or qualifications that we'll need to look at for each project to make sure that we can use the program comment. First of all is the applicability of it. And basically, the first test is it on or affecting either National Park Service land or tribal lands? It's not a showstopper if the answer is yes. It's just you have to coordinate with the Park Service if it's affecting a national monument or on or affecting a national monument, a national park, a battlefield, national historic site, things like that. You'll just need to show that we've initiated a consultation as well with the Park Service. Similarly, if it's on or affecting tribal lands, you would need to go through the Section 106 process normally, unless there's a written agreement in place with the tribe and the federal agency. And then after that, the program comment looks at whether there are historic properties in your project area or not. If there's no historic properties present, you have to go through a few steps to confirm that or to reach a kind of certainty that there's a low probability of affecting any historic properties. The first is an APE is the area of potential effects, which is essentially your project area. Has it been surveyed within the last 10 years? And if the answer is yes, then you can go to the next step. Is the area previously disturbed? And is the probability for archaeological or buried historic properties low? And then if the and if it's not previously disturbed, then you can also look at whether there is a high or low probability for finding archaeological sites, and that's based on archaeological expertise, familiarity with the area, or similar geomorphology in the area. So, is the ground deposit similar to places where they found other archaeological sites nearby? If we, initially in the desktop review, if we find the historic properties are present, then we would look at these conditional exemptions, and you can see that it's most of the basic construction types that we anticipate with BEAD projects. Um, and with each of those, there's a certain conditions that need to be met to be able to say, yes, we're doing above ground on existing poles, and we've met all these other conditions associated with that conditional exemption. And then also you would look at even if you have these conditional exemptions, are we able to avoid adverse effects or avoid the historic properties in your project area? And there may be, if there's historic properties that we may not be able to avoid, or we don't know the full extent of them, that's where that consultation with SHPO will come in. And your cultural resource consultant may recommend we do a survey in advance of construction or monitoring during construction in case there are any inadvertent discoveries of cultural materials. I'll skip down to the bottom of the slide first. So I just mentioned your cultural resource consultant. If you are looking for a qualified cultural resource consultant, here are some of the qualifications in this bottom left box in green that you want to ask about or have them meet. First of all, there's a Secretary of the Interior puts out professional qualification standards. At minimum, you want someone who meets the archaeology standards. Ideally, you probably want someone who meets the archaeology and either the architectural history or history qualifications. Additionally, you want to look for someone who has Colorado experience. With the probability that I was talking about earlier, that's really based on an archaeologist's experience and their experience working in a specific area. So someone who has a lot of Colorado experience will be able to make a case or make that determination of high or low probability based on their experience working in the state and experience with other archaeological sites. And then finally, you want someone who has a Colorado state archaeology permit. That's going to guarantee that they can access the file, the records on file at the SHPO to be able to do that first desktop review. It requires a qualified archaeologist and have those credentials to access it. And then if your project does need a survey or monitoring, they'll need that state permit to be able to do that for you. So here and in the numbered steps, I just kind of laid out kind of what the two processes are. If we're going through the program, using the program comment for your project, or if we have to do the standard Section 106 process. With the program comment process, that first step, that file search, is something that your qualified cultural resource consultant will be able to do for you. Essentially, it's submitting a shapefile to the SHPO, and in a few weeks, you get back GIS and tabular data on the sites that are in the vicinity of your project. Your consultant would then review those file search results and to look at them within the context of that program comment. Do we have historic properties that are in your project area? What is the recency of the surveys? And then if they need to, that next step, what is the probability or what is the likelihood that there are undiscovered archaeological deposits in your project area? And then if there are historic properties, like I said on the last slide, they would look at those conditional exemptions for your specific type of project construction. And then this class one report, class one is basically just a summary of that desktop review material or data. So they would put into it. It's a very short report, but it would be the file search results of the previous surveys and the previously identified sites and properties in your project area. And then also we'd want them in that report to talk about how your project is meeting those conditions for that program comment. Um, if you for whatever reason we can't use the program comment for a specific project, we would have to go to the standard Section 106 process. It starts very much the same way. You do a desktop review, but then you jump kind of into the next step is that field survey, which is going to probably require some time in the field and then some additional time after that preparing a what's called a class 3 report, which is a little bit more in depth than that class 1 report, which require more time to produce. And then you're looking at consultation with the SHPO, tribes, and consulting parties, and that usually um, involves sending the report to SHPO to review with a determination of eligibility, National Register eligibility for any properties or sites that were identified, as well as potential effects. Um, SHPO and tribes and consulting parties get a regulatory mandated 30-day review period. So that is adding some of the time onto your timeline, your compliance timeline as well. And then if you end up in an area where you're having adverse effects on one or more historic properties, then that's going to extend the timeline a little bit more because you're going to need to consult with SHPO and consulting parties and tribes to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects. And if you end up in a mitigation situation, it usually results in what's called an agreement document, a memorandum of agreement, where you lay out some of those mitigation requirements, which again is kind of adding additional time to the compliance timeline. But I think we're pretty confident most of the BEAD projects are going to go through that program comment process, which is streamlined, and we're currently working with the Colorado SHPO right now to kind of integrate the streamlined program comment process into their existing processes, so we can really cut down on their review time as well. But as Serena mentioned early on, I think with the categorical exclusion questionnaire that we'll include in the guidance document, and then also with the permitting questionnaire that'll be in the document. Um, Getting that information kind of complete and getting it to us early in the process and as complete as we can will help us really determine whether your project is going to be able to use the program comment process and how long that process may take for your specific project. And that is our last slide. So I'll pause, see if anybody has any questions. I think let's see. So in the chat, I think Emily McMillan had said the program comment is also not applicable to undertakings that would occur on or affect national monuments, national memorials, national historic parks. Um, Correct. I think that's the first test is it it is applicable, but you have to include consulting with the Park Service on if the project is on or affecting those types of properties.
Yeah, 100%. You said it. I was just phrasing it a different way.
Thanks. So yeah, anybody have any questions about Section 106 or any of the other environmental laws that Serena spoke about or the permitting process? And again, I'll just reiterate, we are working with CBO to get this guidance document out to you as soon as possible. We may even try to get the questionnaires out earlier because I know some of you may be bringing consultants on board and itching to get them started on doing some of the desktop reviews for your project.
Looks like we don't have very many questions right now.
It was a lot of
Um,
information.
yeah, it is.
And the presentation will be on the CBO website as well. So some of those links that, especially that Serena included in her slides, will be available too.
Chad, I do have one quick question. This is Emily again.
Sure.
And maybe you answered it, but it has to do with the SHPO consultation. Is the applicant going to be submitting the program comment package to the SHPO, or will that be something that's done in coordination with CBO? Should they wait until CBO is engaged to submit the program comment information to the SHPO?
Um, I will say we're currently in process of figuring out the best path for that, but I would say for now, hold off on submitting anything to the SHPO, just because we are kind of working out those that kind of sequential step. Certainly we want to make sure that we're having conversations with grantees and their consultants on their projects before and getting on the same page of the requirements and for using the program comment and what documentation we'll need to give to the SHPO. We are also kind of looking at doing some kind of form or a cover sheet that can kind of provide an easy way for with that program comment package so that the SHPO can easily look at it and match that up to parts of the documentation package to speed up their review as well.
Perfect. I think that's great. Second question then as a follow-up, what about early conversations regarding the area of potential effect that's appropriate to use in the records check?
Yes, we'll have some guidance in the guidance document as well on a kind of a standardized um, buffer for the file search. I think since we're using that file search not only to identify historic properties in the APE, but also potentially informing a probability assessment, we'll probably, go with a pretty standard 1 mile buffer, but we're still kind of having conversations with the SHPO about that specifically. Um, and we want to make sure that we're kind of standardizing as much as we can the area of potential effect for different project construction types.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
Uh, any other questions? If there's not, I have an observation that I've made while you guys were doing the presentation and based on some feedback that I've received and just the fact that my son is very into birds. He's taken ornithology at CSU. I was looking at the map, the codex, and it looks like every bird affects everything from the Front Range to the western border. Just about every bird has a breeding or migratory path there. How do you handle that whenever it comes to doing your reviews? I mean, I know the consultants are going to have their hands full trying to pull this together, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And it's not, I mean, there are ranges for like geese,
Hmm.
wintering grounds, things like that aren't going to trigger any kind of reviews because they're
Okay.
just documenting their range. But if you've got raptor nests, bald golden eagles, or state and federally listed species, that is going to require at least a conversation with the CPW or Fish and Wildlife to determine, if any additional consultations
Mhm.
needed.
Okay.
Yeah, because there are a lot of projects that just, even though they are in the range, do not impact the species. So that's
Yeah.
where having a qualified consultant on board is going to make it a lot easier because
Okay.
they can look at your construction type, your project, and say there's no
Yeah.
impacts. So it doesn't matter if
Yeah.
we get your map.
It's just interesting how it follows that I-25 corridor just perfectly, line right there, and then goes west, all the mountain ranges with just a few spots. Because I clicked across several different types of birds, and it was just amazing how they overlap.
Yeah, definitely. Good job security for consultants, right?
Yes. Um, well, just as a reminder, we have a one scheduled office hour, but we are going to extend it for another month. We will add 4 more office hours. We're looking at different items to include in those office hours, But if there's any topics or subjects that we haven't covered or you'd like to cover in more depth, let us know. We'll consider seeing how we can get that in one of the office hours in the future. And then also, if you're a consultant online and would like to put your name and number in the chat for those to reach out to you, please do so. Oh, Kristen, I see that you already did that. Thank you. Um, let's see. Brian Shepherd. Oh, let folks know that April 15th, we're hosting a free web. Okay, free webinar. That's good. Anything else that I didn't see in the chat? Okay, thank you, Laura. Alex, thank you. Emily, thank you for putting your information in there. Um, I know this is a lot of information and it really is probably going to look overwhelming at the time, but it's one step at a time, guys. Follow the process one step at a time and lean on your consultants to get you the right information and set you up for success with your desktop reviews and everything. And we will have further questions and answers, I'm sure, with around NEPA and EHP, but it's not a one-stop shop and it's done. It's ever evolving. And if that's no other questions, we can give you back a little bit of time today. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to hear us out and hopefully get yourself prepared more in advance rather than being shocked by what you find when you get out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
This was
you.
great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.